Mr. Chairman, we welcome the participation of China's Minister of Foreign Affairs in the open debate initiated by the People's Republic of China and devoted to the protection of the goals and principles of the UN Charter. We listened attentively to the speech of the Secretary General. At the invitation of Minister Wang Yi, the Russian delegation was supposed to be represented at today's meeting at the level of the Deputy Foreign Minister responsible for UN affairs, Alexander Alimov. However, despite all our attempts to secure a visa for him from the American side, it was never issued. We regard this not only as Washington's violation of its obligations under the agreement on the headquarters of the United Nations, according to which access to the headquarters of the organization must be ensured for all officials of member states without exception, but also as blatant disrespect toward China's presidency of the Security Council. And today, we are discussing the topic of the UN Charter. Mr. Chairman, the UN Charter, signed following the Second World War, whose 81st anniversary of victory we mark this month, is a unique document that made it possible to build a system of international relations that preserved the world, despite exponentially increased risks and challenges from the horrors of a new global war. The post-war world order has repeatedly undergone tests of strength. At one point, it seemed that the greatest danger was the confrontation of irreconcilable ideologies during the Cold War years. However, years passed. The bipolar system became a thing of the past, and today we have approached a global catastrophe more closely than ever before, observing how not only is the UN Charter being violated everywhere, but its values and the mandatory nature of compliance with it are also being questioned. Instead, a group of countries, mainly Western ones, offers us a certain rules-based order, the rules of which they themselves invent and then present as these so-called universal rules. Today, disregard for the UN Charter, this cornerstone document, has reached its peak. In striving to preserve dominant positions in the world, Western elites have lost all restraint in using crude, forceful methods to advance their political and economic interests. They continue hunting for resources and influence in their former colonies, primarily in Africa. They wage an open struggle against objectionable sovereign states. They spread NATO-centered alliances into new spaces in Asia, directly threatening collective security there. With the help of controlled organizations and media, they divert the attention of the international community from the real root causes of conflicts, creating double standards that confuse those who seek to approach compliance with the UN Charter responsibly. Under these circumstances, we must especially value the Charter, its goals and principles in all their fullness and interconnection, and its mechanisms of checks and balances intended to protect the interests not only of the majority, but also of the minority. We must not forget that this organization was created not by idle theorists, but by people who passed through the crucible of the Second World War and knew from their own experience the price of peace. The uniqueness of the UN Charter lies in the fact that it endowed all states with equal rights. On its basis, the World Organization helped peoples living under colonial dependence to gain freedom and become the world's majority. It proclaimed the goal of promoting the socio-economic progress of all peoples without exception and encouraging respect for the dignity of every individual, regardless of race, sex, language, or religion. It was precisely the Charter that established the imperative of collective action, first and foremost in the field of security, under the leadership of the Security Council. Today we hear much criticism directed at the UN. However, it cannot be denied that the UN changed the international landscape and the way we think. It established and continues to establish an international standard of justice that was inaccessible to humanity before its appearance. And although the world around us is far from ideal, armed conflicts are expanding. People are subjected to persecution because of their native language and faith. As is happening in Ukraine, we know with certainty that this situation does not correspond to the UN Charter, and that we need to return to the principle of justice. Mr. Chairman, the UN Charter embodied justice not only in its goals and mechanisms, but also in its recognition of victory in the Second World War over Nazism and fascism, a reminder of which is Article 107, which provides for the continuing responsibility of what the Charter calls enemy states for their grave crimes resulting from the Second World War. This concerns above all the leader of such states, Nazi Germany. Let us recall that until 1973, the Federal Republic of Germany remained outside the UN, did not recognize borders in Europe, and refused to confirm the non-use of force toward its eastern neighbors. The situation changed with the Moscow Treaty of 1970 between the USSR and Germany, under which only 25 years after Nazi Germany had been defeated, Bonn agreed to recognize territorial realities in Europe and renounce the use of force. This treaty opened the road to the accession of the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic to the UN, and laid the foundation for cooperation in Europe. The era of cooperation in Europe brought prosperity, part of which became the reunification of Germany. However, short-sighted politicians in Europe decided to be more cunning. They decided that cooperation was not their method, that it was better to use blackmail and pressure, that it was necessary once again to seize lands in the East, this time under the banner of NATO and European Union expansion. These imperial projects are moving eastward without asking the peoples of the countries being drawn into them, relying instead on the bribery of elites and color revolutions. But today the European elite has decided to drop the masks and place its bet on open armed force, actively involving itself in the crisis in Ukraine, including through unprecedented weapons supplies. As we have already reported at one of these meetings of the Security Council, Germany does not shy away from fueling the conflict in Gaza with weapons, including new technologies. On April 22nd, Germany's Minister of Defense decided to make the aggressive plans of his state public knowledge. The key documents defining the strategic directions of Germany's armed forces were published, from which it follows that this country intends to become the principal military force in Europe and bear responsibility for its security, as written in this document. The goal of an unprecedented buildup of armed forces and weaponry is proclaimed. Moreover, Germany, jointly with France, is establishing a certain high-level governing nuclear group and proclaims participation in doctrinal dialogue and strategic cooperation with France concerning the necessary combination of conventional and missile weapons and French nuclear capabilities. Germany is beginning to move its military presence eastward, dispatching a contingent to Lithuania. The goals and actions announced by Germany contradict the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany of 1990, which serves as the basis for the unification of this country and imposes specific restrictions on Germany's armed forces, as well as a ban on possessing nuclear weapons. This same treaty also states that only peace should emanate from German territory. Let us ask ourselves whether Germany's remilitarization and policy of confrontation bring Europe prosperity comparable to what this region achieved during the era of cooperation with the USSR and Russia from the 1970s through the 2000s. In our view, the answer is obvious, and it is expressed not only in indicators of economic development. Mr. Chairman, other countries falling under Article 107 of the UN Charter are also engaged in remilitarization. Japan, for example, is developing its armed forces and weapons supplies, and is openly discussing amendments to its constitution, which imposed restrictions in this area following the Second World War. The policy of remilitarization undermines the UN-centered international system. Countries that suffered defeat in the Second World War are seeking respectable pretexts for rewriting its results, and no one should be deceived by their rhetoric. This is a very dangerous tendency that deserves the attention of the entire international community. Mr. Chairman, throughout the world, the situation is balancing on the edge between war and peace. Our attention is directed with concern toward the Middle East and toward militant rhetoric regarding Cuba. We are convinced that this path leads nowhere. We must help one another avoid a global crisis and restore the UN to the role of an honest broker. However, for this, as in the past, it is necessary once again to confirm a consensus on the basic parameters of international interaction. We are convinced that achieving this goal is served by the initiative put forward by Russian President Putin in June 2024 on the formation of a new architecture of equal and indivisible security in Eurasia, one maximally open to all states and sub-regional organizations of the continent. The elements laid at its foundation guarantee every state the right to choose the means of ensuring its own security, but in such a way as not to infringe upon the interests of other states in this sphere. In October of last year, within the framework of Russia's presidency of the Security Council, a presidential statement devoted to the 80th anniversary of the United Nations was adopted. It is important that in this document members of the Council reached unity concerning the necessity of implementing the goals and principles of the UN Charter in their entirety, as well as of comprehensively responding to threats to international peace and security, which necessarily must include all alliances as well. The elimination of the root causes of international contradictions and overcoming the crisis of confidence in the world organization can and must be achieved through the conscientious coordination and implementation of interstate decisions and adaptation of the UN system to changed realities while preserving the leading role of member states. That is precisely why the UN 80 Reform Initiative should be implemented under close state supervision and in full compliance with the resolutions and decisions of UN bodies. It is vitally important to ensure that the prerogatives of the Security Council are not called into question, because it is precisely this body that, in accordance with the Charter, bears the principal responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. We expect that with the election of a new Secretary General this year, the World Organization will gain a second wind. For an impermissibly long time, it has remained removed from the tasks of eliminating the root causes of conflicts, restoring trust among member states, and conducting impartial work on resolving the most acute crisis situations. In order for it to effectively fulfill its potential, its Secretariat must strictly comply with Article 100 of the Charter regarding observance of the principle of neutrality and equal distance without any reservations. We invite interested partners to an honest discussion and energetic work in the interests of the prosperity of all humanity.